Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA is the membership body for academics, artists and advocates interested in animal issues. ASA is the best way to keep up to date with the latest happenings in relation to animal conferences, animal-related publications, jobs that might be going in the field of animal studies, and also conferences. ASA, in fact, has its own conference that it runs every 2 years, and that conference is coming up this year in August, so August 2017. If you're listening to this episode around the time it comes out, it's not too late to sign up for the ASA conference. It will be held at the University of Adelaide, and everything you need to know is available online. Okay, well, I'm in beautiful, beautiful Melbourne town, one of my favourite places in the whole world, and it is quite a nice day. The sun is shining. Of course, it's cold, but that's essential. And I am on the grounds of the University of Melbourne, where I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Susan Pyke, or Sue. Now, I know Sue from when I was at the University of Melbourne, and in fact, Sue and I have done a little bit of work together. We've published something together. We've written something together, and it's currently being reviewed. So hopefully one day soon we'll be able to announce that a joint publication will be out between us. So I've known Sue for a very long time. She is a very engaged animal studies scholar. She's been coming to the Animal Studies Reading Group that is held monthly at the University of Melbourne for many years, which is how I first got to know her. So Sue is in the School of Culture and Communications at the University of Melbourne. Her interests are centred around literature and the nonhuman. Today we're going to consider Sue's piece, Divine Wings, Literature Flights Between... I should have checked. Again, it's traditional that I don't know people's names, but in this case, I'm not 100% sure I've got the title of the journal article correct. So why don't I welcome you in, Sue, and you can help me unpack the title of the journal article as well as its meaning. So welcome to the podcast, Sue.
Thank you so much, Siobhan.
So, Sue, what does Cyclic Avian...
Let me give you the title, shall I?
Okay.
Let me see if it can roll off my tongue.
Okay.
Divine Wings. Mm-hmm. Literary flights between the Cyclic Avian in Emily Bronte's poems and Oblivia's Swan song in Alexis Wright's The Swan book. And there is a lot to unpack in that title, you're right.
Yeah, it's and now we should also say for people who like to go and read the journal article as well as listen to the episode, it appeared in Otherness in 2016. So, Sue, why don't you start by telling us what inspired you to write the article? And if we haven't come to the meaning of the title in full by the end, I'll then make that the follow-up question.
That's a great idea. You know, what inspired this article was the Swan book. A good friend gave me the book. I'd been wanting to read it. We'd been talking about it. And she gave it to me. And it is the most beautiful book. You know, some of those books where you just, even before you open it, you think, this is actually going to change the way I see the world. So Alexis Wright's The Swan book was like that. It was an absolute joy to read. Not many people have read it, though, because it's really hard. And often people read thinking that they need to understand things, whereas I actually don't mind meaning being obscured and just getting what I can out of it. And I think having explored it more deeply through the growing conversation around that novel, that's actually fine. And Alexis Wright is absolutely fine with that. She is a brilliant writer. And if I ever was able to put something on the Year 12 syllabus or on any kind of reading list, I think the Swan book should be the first, because not only is it a most brilliant literary work. It's what we need to be reading as an Australian. She just deals with the issues that we're facing right now. And I saw her talk, and it was at a creative writing conference, and the person who was talking with her in that conversation said, "Look, why are you writing novels? You're a really respected elder." She's an elder of the Wanyee nation. You're on whatever level you like of government policy, but you've kind of stepped back from that to write the Swan book. And she said, that's because this is what changes people, and this is what really, really matters. And I think she's right. I think what she's done in the Swan book is make the fraught issue of reconciliation front of mind in a way that just can change the way that we can think what Australia is. It's a dystopian novel. It looks forwards. We don't ever really know, but let's say somewhere between the 25 to 75 years that we know are going to pretty much change the way we live in this world, change the world, change the animals that are in this world. And she talks about the relationship between Oblivia, who is the most amazing, damaged, brilliant, transformative character, and her relationship with swans, and that's her kinship line. So I had also been reading a lot of Emily Bronte's poems. So I'd written a lot on her novel. That was what I did for my PhD. But I remember very early in that reading her book of poetry, the collected works, Down Where I Come From. And it was, as I read it, and I remember it was a long time ago, but it was really sunny, and there were the birds of where I come from in conversation with the birds that she was writing to. And so I kind of had this connection. And when I was lucky enough, I got funded to go to where Emily Bronte comes from. And my first walk up on the moors, this bird just came around me, closer up and down. I said, hello, Emily. And the bird kind of swooped down and went away. So I had this sense that it was the right time to write this article. So one of the things that I'm really interested in animal studies is this question of the divine, or what might be called, it's hard to put a word to it. So at the moment, the word I'm settling with is the sublime, because the sublime is an often carelessly used word, and it has a long, long history. But essentially what it looks at is what's inutterable, what you can't kind of put your fingers on, what you can't necessarily put into words, but what you might be able to offer up to another person through the effect it has on you. So I think that's what Alexis Wright does, and I think that Emily Bronte does too. And what makes them special to me is that they are very non-hierarchical in the way that they see animals. And to my mind, I think that's the way that we can, the more we get into that way of relating to animals, the more productive and generative those relations will be.
So, to the best of your knowledge, is this the first time that these two authors have been considered together? And also, are they often the subject of analysis by people interested in animal studies?
To the best of my knowledge, never put together. They are, because of the way they write, probably, well, Emily Bronte is becoming more of an author of interest in that way. There's really only one well-established author who does look at the way that animals are represented in Wuthering Heights. But people do talk a lot about her relationship with the natural world in general. So that's kind of not a new conversation. Probably it's new in the sense that it's being drawn into literary animal studies. The Swan book, Alexis Wright, I think, must be and should be talked about more in that light, because Carpinteria, her very more famous novel, also is brilliant in the way that it allows that the non-human to be present in the most natural way. It's not a motif, and it's not a metaphor. They're there and they're present as much as any other character in the novel.
So no doubt many people listening are familiar with the expression animal studies, certainly if they've listened to other episodes. And so I think it's probably fair to say that, generally speaking, animal studies is the interdisciplinary study of non-human animals, usually in a non-invasive way. So it's not about using them as subjects of research or anything like that. It's about trying to understand them and incorporating them into thinking. So if we take that and apply it then to literature studies, what is animal studies within literature studies trying to achieve, or what's its focus or objective?
I think the term literary animal studies is quite new. And I remember, thank you, Siobhan, when you brought Robert McKay and Annette Pyke into a symposium just a few floors up from where we are. That was the first real sense for me that there was a field. Before then, it felt much more to me, because I was feeling my way, that it was possible to talk about animals in a critical way, but I didn't have a sense that apart from the giants in the field, your Jacques Derridas, your Donna Haraway's, that people were engaging with texts and using the text as a way of exploring those issues. So when was that now? That was must be nearly 5 or 6 years ago, I guess. And I think in that period of time that the field has kind of settled itself into that name, literary animal studies. There's, as you probably know, some great series coming out from publishers like Palgrave Macmillan that they're looking at literature and animals, and that creates its own momentum. But more and more, so that's kind of, if you like, the core of the turn. But in the other fields that I'm interested in, so Victorian studies, Romanticism, even Gothic studies, there's more and more conferences that are kind of opening up those discourses. And I think also what's happening is you've got the animal turn, but you've also got the material turn, so that once you start thinking about the world in the way that Karen Barad might describe, where humans are no longer this kind of enclosed being, this idea of of singularity is kind of questioned, and you get more of a sense of co-affectivity between person to person, then it's not a big step to think about person to non-person, creature to creature. And so that also gives people like myself that are really interested in thinking new ways that we might talk about human, non-human relations, a way to bring that discourse into other really progressive ways of viewing the world. So the kind of, from my point of view, I started off thinking about feminism, then it seemed like a natural progression to start thinking about eco-criticism, particularly when I was introduced to Val Plumwood by Kate Rigby. And from eco-criticism, once you start thinking about the world and the harms that are being done to the world, and you realise that what human oppressions of the non-human are doing environmentally to the world, then you can't not speak about that. So they're very much, for me anyway, intersecting fields, and to try to etch out one space without allowing that interdisciplinary conversations between the others, it seems very reductive and not productive at all.
So climate change is a big theme of your paper. Can you tell us something about the light that the two authors that you focus on, Bronte and Wright, what light they shed on your understanding of that issue?
I think that for this paper anyway, the line about that you mentioned earlier, what is the Cyclic Avian, was the linchpin for me in this paper. So with Bronte's work, seasonality is so much a part of the way that she positions her poetry. So it's always the beginning of the spring or the coming of winter, and what's happening to all the creatures. And birds are a creature of great interest to her. So I kind of put that together with the in the article with the fact that what was also happening, and this is very present in a novel, Wuthering Heights, was that country England, or her area, Yorkshire, was industrialising really quickly. So textiles were booming. You had all the rivulets, the becks, being their energy harvested. Their integrity was also being compromised by the dyes. So you had environmental spoilage to a degree that hadn't happened before. And as I point out in the article, at the moment when people talk about the particles in the earth that are creating climate change, the graphs that you see over and over again that just show that trajectory up, they begin at that time that Bronte was writing. So to me, to make that progression from the rapidly industrialising world to where Alexis Wright is situated, where people's country is no longer as it was, where you've got these songlines that are shared by humans and non-humans that are changing because creatures that might never have gone into one area are now coming into an area, and that's an incredibly fundamental change that's occurring. So I think that to me it's that inexorable kind of shift, and I guess it's hard to feel hopeful when you look back 200 years and think, well, here we are, and in your brief lifespan. But I think for me anyway, to begin recognising that is at least a start of making choices that might be able to at least slow that down or create a new way of being. And people who are involved in thinking through songlines and their ancestral stories accept that there's always been change. You know, for 200 years, if you're an Indigenous Australian, your songlines are constantly changing because your homelands are not what they were. But I think it gives pause to think about what that means when you're looking not only at the 200 years from Bronte's time, but the 40,000, 60,000 changes that occurred in that short period of time.
Beautiful. So, Sue, what's your hope with this article, and I guess with literary animal studies? Is it that we will all be more mindful of the non-human other when we read pieces of literature, or is it that people who are already interested in literature might start to think about non-human animals through your interpretation? What drives you or inspires you about this work?
That's such a good question. It comes down to reading. So you asked what inspired this novel, and it was a response to reading that book of poetry and reading that novel. And I think everyone reads from their own position. So there's a great theorist called Jacques Rancière who talks about ignorances, right? So he says instead of talking about knowledges, it kind of brings it to a level playing field. It says, look, everybody, or what I take from Rancière is everybody reads from wherever they're situated. And so I might read from a position where 17 of the first years of my life was in the country, and other people might read from a completely different position, and one is not necessarily, with reference to your the name of the podcast, but neither is more knowing, Right? There's different ways of engaging with literature or with any work of art, or maybe even with any conversation, and it always comes from what has come before. So I guess from my point of view, why I love literary animal studies is because I love reading, and I love talking to other people that love reading, just as I love writing, and I love talking to other people that love writing. And those two things are so entwined that to be able to have a conversation about that and embedded in something that matters in your gut from a political point of view, I can't think of anything else that there is actually nothing else I'd rather be doing, you know. So, and I think that that's from a writerly point of view. It's this question. There's this wonderful theologian who uses a lot of Luce Irigaray's work. She's a radical feminist, and she talks about the devoted reader or the religious reader, and how she situates that is that when you read something that you absolutely adore, and she uses Elizabeth Smart, who has this great short novel called I sat by Grand Central Station. I sat down and I wept. I think it's called. Magnificent piece of work. And she writes about that with such devotion, with such love, that you when you pick up that short novel, as I did, you read it through her as well as through yourself. So it becomes, just as you might read a novel about Yorkshire differently once you've been to Yorkshire, you read a novel differently when you read it through someone else's lens. And I think that's beautiful. That's just part of what makes literary works so alive. So they take on their own life through other people's way of reading.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Sue. It's fabulous to speak to someone with such passion. Now, I ask everyone who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes, I am.
Okay, Sue, can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yes, I can. It was Jacques Derrida, who I used a lot in my master's thesis as well, and it was The Animal That Therefore I Am. And about the same time, because I was working on a paper, I read in one stint, sitting in the Bayeux Library, Companion Species Manifesto. You know, when you think, I've got a little bit of time, and I think I missed a little bit of a conference because of that. But it was just those two pieces I read in conjunction, and it's hard to sort of separate them because one is so theoretical and one is so applied, and I guess I sit somewhere in the middle of those two approaches. So they were the two really influential. I guess they were the pieces that said, hey, this is important and you can. They gave me permission to think about it, to give my intellectual energy to that issue.
Wonderful. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Well, I can, because that was a paper I was working on. So what happened was I was giving I think it must have been very early in my PhD, and I gave my first paper, and one of my fantastic supervisors, Marion May Campbell, said, the way you're talking about Heathcliff and dogs, you really should think about that a bit more, Sue. And my other supervisor, Grace Moore, said, that's a great idea. They're both dog people. Do that. So I wrote Heathcliff's Howl, and that was a paper I presented at the ASA conference, the first one I went to, that I met you at.
Wonderful. Lovely. Whereabouts, what city was that conference in?
South Bank in Queensland.
Oh, Queensland.
Yeah.
Lovely.
And that's when you came in. I think I was giving that paper, and you came in and said, look, if anyone's from Melbourne, there's a Knowing Animals reading group, and you really should come. And you gave me your card, and that nice. Set me well and truly on a really easy road.
Oh, nice. So if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
If I have to name one, it would be Val Plumwood, because I think for me she was the bridge between my background in feminist scholarship and really pointing out the intersectionality in other forms of oppression against the environment, against animals. It was her feminism and the mastery of nature that just lays it all out, that sort of progression of Enlightenment thinking that still shapes the way that human non-human relations are operating now. And that was almost, if you like, my blueprint that made me think, yes, this is why, as a feminist, I need to be talking about non-human animals.
Mm-hmm. Fabulous. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
I think it probably depends on what academic you're talking about. So if you're an academic like me that's mainly in the classroom, it's allowing those conversations to happen with students and bringing non-human animals into the room and showing the impact that those creatures have on the overall world. And I haven't ever had a class yet where people have said, oh, look, I think this is irrelevant. And that's when I teach in environmental studies and I teach in literature. And I think that normalising those discussions are really, really important. And I also think that having no animal products at their conferences would be an excellent thing.
Helpful. So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be? That
one's really easy. Don't kill them.
Don't kill them.
Don't use them. It's like, you know, if you're asked the same question, if humans weren't in the position of power, it's like, well, can you please not kill me and just stop using me for your own purposes? I've got my own life. I think that if once you stop that willingness to abuse others, then everything else kind of falls on from that. Yeah.
So, Sue, what are you working on next?
Well, I sort of mentioned my interest in the sublime. So I'm reading a lot of this&nbsp and trying to work out what I can do with her fantastic way of thinking of the world as interactions as a mode of attunement, right? So she says, look, we can never know animals, but we might be able to at least get to know individuals. And so she takes this really interesting anthropological perspective. So that I've sort of got her voice on one side of me, and then the other thing that I'm really interested in is metamorphosis. So what happens, and this is the creative work that I'm working on as well, what happens when you try to imagine, or even if you can become less human, more non-human. And so my work at the moment is to see what I can learn about just a few other species. I've done a lot of thinking about snakes, which was, you know, you change when you start to know creatures apart from knowing them, knowing them from a physiological point of view. So that's my big kind of project, little projects, thinking about George Eliot, who's another great author, thinking about how you might be able to represent metamorphosis creatively, and then in what ways can we approach the sublime or the divine that's not unknowable in a way that can change those human-non-human relations.
Wow. Sounds complicated. I look forward
to I like it, Siobhan.
So, Sue, how can people find out more about your work?
I'm on academia.edu, and I've got a blog, very quiet and in a deep pool of unknowability. Cool. And you can find that under Sue Hall Pyke.
Mm-hmm. And you're also on Twitter?
I am also on Twitter.
Yeah.
Also under Sue Hall Pyke.
Yeah. Well, Sue, thank you so much for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast, where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, Knowing Animals is on Twitter at knowing_animals, as am I at SO_S. We also have a Facebook page, Knowing Animals. And don't forget to subscribe to us on iTunes and to also leave a review. iTunes are all powerful. The podcast's availability to others rises and falls with iTunes. And one of the ways in which you can help the podcast be accessible and be known and help more people know animals is by leaving a review or subscribing via iTunes. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.